As part of the human rights project in the 21st century, we are having conversations with individuals and institutions committed to promoting human rights and also committed to protect human rights globally. My name is Nataša Briški. I'm a podcaster from Slovenia, a co-founder of a media network, Metas List. And with me is my esteemed colleague, Aljaž Pengel-Bitens, joining me from Luxembourg. Excellent columnist and commentator. And if you want to know more about the political situation in Slovenia, you should definitely not miss his blog, Sleeping with Pengovski. Excellent writing with some very witty touch, Aljaž.
Nataša, thank you. You're always so kind to me. And for the rest of you who don't know, Nataša is an accomplished journalist, foreign correspondent for one of the largest, if not the largest, Slovenian TV network. And she is also an accomplished explorer, visiting the North Pole, no less. But Nataša, enough about us. Today we are going to talk about the human rights in the 21st century, as you mentioned. And we are dwarfed by our most esteemed guest, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament for the lower house of the Indian Parliament. Mr. Tharoor, welcome.
Very good to be with you all. Thank you.
It's an honor to have you, and thank you for the opportunity to interview you. So, trying to address the most pertinent current issues concerning breaches and advancement of human rights, we would like to hear your thoughts. As a long-standing politician, as Aljaž said, also part of the United Nations for many decades, your thoughts on the human rights and the situation in your region. So, what would you say are the human rights challenges facing the world's largest and most diverse democracy? What are like the key human rights issues in India today? And if you could name a couple, that would be great.
Well, I mean, there are more than a couple, I'm sorry to say, but I'm proud to start off with the observation you just made that India is, after all, the largest and most diverse democracy. It's a multi-party system with free elections. It's a federal system with fairly autonomous states. It's a parliamentary democracy. The parliament itself has become more and more a captive of the majority, which is the majority held by the ruling party. So all of these things are good because they, of course, limit the damage that can be done by arbitrary actions violating human rights. But human rights violations do exist, and I want to start off by stressing that every one of the violations I'm talking about has been first identified, uncovered, and reported by Indians. In other words, we're looking at problems, and the problems really exist, but in our democracy, Indian journalists, Indian human rights activists, Indian opposition politicians are the ones who expose, reveal, argue, debate all of these things. And that, again, is the strength of our democracy. But the problems exist, no question about it. We have the whole list of them. Unlawful and arbitrary killings are taking place in every part of the country. But, you know, we are a country of nearly 1.4 billion people. And so sometimes a handful of killings here and there become a blip on the radar, but there are still human lives that are being taken care of in this way. And once in a while, there are also extrajudicial killings perpetrated by the police. There have been many, many credible reports of torture in police stations. India has signed the torture convention, but has not ratified it. It was brought to the lower house of parliament when my party was in power, passed there, but it has never passed the upper house. And the current government, which has now been in power for 7 years, has taken no steps to conclude the ratification process. So torture and other cases of cruel, inhumane treatment or punishment in prison are routinely reported, I'm sorry to say. There have been an increase and uptick in arbitrary arrests and detention by government authorities. This government has strengthened a law called the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, passed ostensibly against terrorism, but used indiscriminately against all sorts of critics of the authorities in various states, including journalists in some cases. There is one particular journalist arrested under the provisions of that act who for 14 months has been in detention with no charges yet levied, let alone an opportunity to defend himself in court. There are harsh and life-threatening conditions in prison. We've had a sad story of a Jesuit priest who was a human rights activist in his 80s, who was treated in appalling ways. His hands were trembling because of Parkinson's. He needed a sipper to be able to sip water. And he had to appeal to a court to even be granted a sipper, which any prison warden should have given him. And it took him several weeks to be able to get something as basic as that. So terrible conditions. And the poor man died in a prison hospital from various illnesses during the COVID pandemic. This is, of course, deeply, deeply distressing to those of us who valued India's humanitarian, civilian, and civilizational traditions. Then there have been restrictions on freedom of expression and the press, restrictions that are technically lawful restrictions, that is, infringements under the provisions of the Constitution, Article 19, which, while guaranteeing freedom, authorize the government to limit it for very specific grounds. But there have also been illegal restrictions, including violence or threats of violence, and of course, unjustified detentions and prosecutions of journalists, such as the example I mentioned to you. There's been an awful lot of infringement on internet freedom with the use of the laws and legal provisions to actually go ahead and block internet sites, shut down the internet in places like Kashmir and other disturbed areas at various times, and take action thereby against free expression on the internet. There have been new restrictive rules brought in by the government on non-governmental organizations receiving foreign funding, which have had the practical effect of their being able or unable to take steps within their own mandates against governmental actions. There's been other examples of what we would normally consider human rights infringements, such as, for example, widespread abuses against women, including violence and rape, which have never been, in many cases, properly investigated and accountability ensured. There have been incidents of violations of religious freedom, extremist groups breaking into churches, mosques, and other places of worship and interfering with the right to worship freely. This has continued as recently as this week with a couple of churches being attacked in northern India. There's been other infringements on minority rights and minority practices of their own religious customs. And then, of course, we've never fully overcome the problem of child labor, which is, again, a human rights violation of the rights of the child. So there's a huge, long list there that I've given you. And that list is a dismaying one for any Democrat who values human rights. And all of this happens. I just want to say that it's not the whole picture, undoubtedly. A lot of us are, after all, functioning in a country where I'm free to say this to you and to say it to an Indian audience. As a member of parliament, I say it in parliament as well. But the fact still remains that these things do exist, and that's not something we can ever be terribly proud of or happy about.
Dr. Tharoor, in Europe recently, we are faced with a wave of populism that, among other things, espouses a narrative saying that we too have values, they're only slightly different than, quote unquote, your values or the other people's values. And which reminds me of, say, a later Cold War era when the bipolar world was locked between the fight for democracy and then, say, single-party oppression, where the same narrative occurred. Western values are not as our values, and which brings me to the question of universal human rights, where often people today would say, well, you know, we too believe in human rights only slightly differently than you guys believe in human rights. So are we still talking about universal human rights? Does such a notion exist in the 21st century?
Yes, now you're asking the question, I'm assuming, with specific reference to India, because at the global level, the debate is slightly different. In India, there's no serious debate against your and my understanding of human rights is the official understanding as well. So nobody in the governmental or ruling party structure is seeking refuge on the grounds that it's a different understanding of human rights. In fact, there, I think we have a clear understanding, because I wrote an article many years ago now, 3 decades ago or more, which was published in the Nordic Journal of International Law in, I think, 1988, but on whether human rights are universal. And one of my mischievous questions was, if you stop a man in traditional dress from beating his wife, are you protecting her human rights or violating his? And that was the kind of argument that was being said. It was culture, and culture comes first. And my answer was no, coercion comes first. And I think we don't really need to debate that today, because that's not the debate in India. In India, it's the same degree of populism has been growing. We have a populist government and a populist ruling party with a prime minister who has claimed to be a far more authentic representative of the people than those whom he has replaced. But at the same time, what is worrying about their brand of populism is that they say they always have the nation's interests at heart, whereas we liberals are standing up for individual interests. And in so doing, we are being anti-national. This is very dangerously close to the kinds of doctrines that were popular in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. So it worries me. I mean, anti-national becomes a term of abuse for the political opposition. Then you realize that the populism has gone a bit too far. But I will say that if you look very seriously at what the government is talking about, it is actually a menace to human rights, because what the government seems to be saying is what we're doing is in the interests of the nation as a collectivity. You're speaking for human rights of individuals who are actually themselves, through their conduct, anti-national, and therefore you yourself are anti-national, which is a very different justification for their human rights violations, but starting from the same premise that the collectivity matters more than the individual, which of course is something unacceptable to any self-respecting advocate of human rights who argues that human rights inheres in the individual.
So you would say it is essential to recognize that universality does not presuppose uniformity.
That's true. I mean, obviously, diversity is built into the way in which the world has to be organized. From the point of view of a country like India, emerging after 200 years of colonial rule, you can be sure that we are particularly sensitive to the notion that other people's perceptions should govern our conduct, and that we too have a culture and a civilization, our own understanding of the world. But nonetheless, there are certain standards. I mean, just as we claim, for example, the same rights of sovereignty that other states in the Westphalian system have claimed, just as we respect the same international law, we are members of the same United Nations and seek a seat in the same Security Council, just as we do all of that, we also have to accept that the human rights conventions and covenants that we have signed and ratified bind us all equally. So I think it would be very difficult for an Indian government to disavow that. Yes, there are diverse interpretations. And certainly in a country like India, some of the problems are a very different order from what you face in Western Europe. I mean, there's no question that very few of you are dealing with a serious threat of terrorist violence or secessionist violence or disturbed areas in the kind of way that you have in India. And so in responding to some of these things, there are sometimes standards of such, shall we say, security conduct that are required to be applied, which may not be necessary at any stage in the West. And these standards can lend themselves to lapses and indeed to abuse in ways for which there is less excuse in Slovenia or Sweden. And therefore, we have laws very similar to yours. The law, for example, does not permit authorities to admit coerced confessions into evidence. But when you're dealing with potential terrorists, and there's an awful lot of people committing acts of violence, security forces can and do sometimes indulge in torture to coerce confessions, and then get people, force them to sign confessional statements that judges may or may not believe were coerced. So there are abuses like that happening. There's no doubt about that. And you can say that there would be really no reason for a policeman apprehending a criminal in your country to fear the kind of consequences of that person being free that our police or our security forces find themselves fearing. I'm not trying to make excuses for them. I'm just saying that circumstances are different, and sometimes there are extenuating reasons, but that does not justify human rights violations in my book or in yours. And we still stand up for the highest standards, even when we acknowledge why that some of those standards have not been met.
You mentioned United Nations, and a couple of weeks ago, the eyes of the world were focused on Glasgow and the conference, the climate conference, COP26. Somehow, India emerged as a villain. You may correct me if you think I'm wrong. As a villain, as a country that is resisting to cut the coal consumption. I was wondering, since the right to clean air, to clean water is a human right, how much of that awareness is in India? Because I also know that Indians are among the biggest victims of climate change. Just wondering, what do people think in your country about that, about the need to act?
I think that, yeah, I've actually written about this. If you Google my article on the subject, I think it was a bit unfair that India emerged as a villain, because actually India is not amongst the really bad guys in the business. India does have a problem. We have a legacy of coal being the principal source of energy, and we just can't suddenly switch it off overnight. We would be plunged into darkness. We're a country where there's still perhaps a third of our population, over 350 million people, who still cannot take for granted what every Slovenian can, which is you can turn a switch on a wall and have your room bathed with light. We don't have every household in our country electrified yet. So there's still very basic developmental challenges we have to overcome. And I think just becoming the voice of what was really an American-Chinese compromise brokered early on in the conference in November, that actually said phase down instead of phase out. India, by articulating it, suddenly got saddled with responsibility for a deal that had actually been worked out between the Chinese and the Americans. Never forget that the Chinese have 17.5% of the world's population and are producing something like 22% of the world's emissions, whereas India, with 17%, only produces 7% of the world's emissions. So we're simply not, genuinely not among the bad guys, but we still have a problem. The air in our capital city of Delhi is unbreathable. And I think of the top 20 polluted air pollution list of cities in the world, 18 are in India. So it's really quite appalling. We are the biggest victims of choking all the way to hospital, of having shortened lifespans because of air pollution. When it comes to other kinds of pollution, toxic sewage in our rivers and water bodies, for example, and the terrible climate change effects of transformed climate, so that we have tornadoes and typhoons and cyclones, and even hit by a couple of tsunamis. We've had it all. We've had floods and droughts. So there's no question that Indians have been victims in a rather dramatic and visible way of the extraordinary challenges facing the world on the climate front. And for that reason, I would argue that what we're looking at, if I may say so, Natasha, is that we're looking at a system which requires India to make adaptations. But at the same time, we have a development challenge. How do we move towards greener forms of energy and less polluting forms of industrialization and development at a time when the developed world is giving very little assistance and is not transferring green technologies to the developing world? We have to develop our own. We need to do more of it. I certainly applaud the government's efforts in the solar business. We need to get far more solar energy going, because most parts of India take sunshine for granted. And we should be transferring that now that it's become a little more viable financially. We need to be transferring more of that into the grid and transferring ourselves into a much more solar-powered system, more electric vehicles, and lots of things like that that need to be done. but it can't be done overnight. No country has done it overnight. The one big difference between the developed West, which is now preaching virtue to the rest of us, and countries like us, is that you folks went through all of this 50, 70, 100 years ago, grew, developed, pulled your people out of poverty, made yourselves prosperous, took power, energy, electricity for granted. And now that you've got it all, you've discovered a religion, you've discovered virtue, you've discovered the climate. And the truth is that we are way behind. So we understand that we all share the same climate in the world, we all share the same problems, and we do need to find common solutions. But responsibility has to be differentiated. And we do feel the West needs to do a lot more in terms of offering assistance to developing countries, particularly in the mitigation front and the adaptation front, and providing greener technologies in affordable ways to all of us, which again, the West has been reluctant to do because the argument is very understandable. They say these technologies have been developed in the private sector and the private sector has to be paid for its work and governments cannot transfer it. If that is so, then government should also be not making unreasonable demands. Final point, India may be using one form of fossil fuel, namely coal, but the West is using oil and gas in exactly the kind of proportions that we're using coal. About 70% of our energy comes from coal, about 70% of your energy comes from oil and gas. Why is oil and gas not controversial, but coal is? Strictly speaking, all fossil fuels ought to be phased down and eventually phased out.
You raise an interesting point besides the fact that we are all basically burning liquid dinosaurs, as my kids put it. But the point of sharing burden as well as ensuring equal or more equal access to resources is key to fighting climate change, obviously. But I wonder, this sort of crisis, be it a health crisis or an ecological crisis, are often excuses to further clamp down on the notion of human rights. Going forward, do you see this as a danger, not just in India? Western world is going to be hit as much by the climate change, is being hit as much by the climate change as India or other Asia-Pacific countries. So is there a danger that together with the environment, we will lose human rights as well?
That's potential issue globally. Though at this stage, I think I see most of the climate change induced violations as essentially things that are not being done willfully by governments, but for example, the involuntary migration of climate refugees. You can't usually blame a government for that, though sometimes, of course, a climate change pattern such as increased desertification or increased drought can force people out, and governments, in order to capture land, can also force people out. So the lines are blurred. In India, I would say that's not a problem. That's one area where our democracy has worked well, is that we have become very good at trying to shield our people from the direct effects of climate change. Our loss of life in climate calamities has been very, very much reduced since the bad old days of, say, the 70s, when you routinely saw headlines of 500 people killed in a cyclone or 1,000 people from a sea inundation. That sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. Warnings, relatively effective meteorological warnings, and a very efficient system, for example, in the coastal areas, to pull people away from vulnerable coastal communities, shelter them until such time as the danger has passed. All of that has worked very well in many Indian states. So I would say that there is one good thing about democracy. When you need people's votes, you try and take care of them. So for the most part, in India, I have no examples to give you of climate change-induced violations at all. I would say that's not a particular issue for us or a particular problem for us. But I would say that we do have, I would say we do have human problems rather than human rights problems. That might be the right way of putting it.
One final question. I know you have a busy schedule today. What would be, in your opinion, human rights issues in the future? If I could name one, and it's a very obvious one, at least for us in Europe, we had a recent very sad story in Slovenia on that, would be a migration. People are moving around due to climate changes and other reasons. And while at UN, you have been working on the migration issues and improving that. So what do you think would be the human rights issues in the future?
I think in India that really isn't a particular issue. I mean, we've always been a country that produces migrants historically, for millennia, one might argue. The so-called gypsies of Europe are migrants from India in the 7th century. So, Indians have been moving in and out, and I wouldn't link it specifically to climate change. If you ask me to pick the biggest human rights issue I worry about, say, in the next 10 or 15 years, it relates to the problem I've already mentioned of arbitrary arrest or detention, which are actually illegal. I mean, it's against the law to do it arbitrarily, and yet both have happened. We've seen the police using special security laws to postpone judicial reviews. I mentioned the example of the journalist who for 14 months hasn't been charged but has been in detention. Sometimes people are detained for longer than they would be convicted for if they were guilty of what they were detained for. And then, there's only so far as the excuse of security risks, terrorism, insurgency can go. You're not supposed to detain an individual without charge for up to 30 days. I mean, you can up to 30 days, but you must bring the person before a judge within 24 hours of arrest, and the judge has to allow you to keep them for up to 30 days. But that is not always being done because of the provisions of special laws like the UAPA that I mentioned, which is specifically supposed to be for terrorism prevention, but is used for all sorts of other cases. And lengthy arbitrary detention, to me, is the biggest human rights problem facing in terms of the political rights of Indian citizens in a democracy. It's compounded by the fact that our court systems are really overburdened, prisons are crowded, there's not enough effective legal action possible because courts are forced to adjourn cases for days on end. It's often said that if you arrest somebody just before a weekend, you can definitely hold them for 3 days, even if they've done nothing wrong. Those things ought to change. I think in our country, as a democracy and a country of which, at least in theory, respects human rights, we have a Human Rights Commission filled with people who say and believe all the right things. This kind of thing has to be tackled on a war footing. And I believe the judiciary ought to show a little more proactive courage in dealing with habeas corpus petitions when such prolonged detentions take place. I have not been happy at all, and I've said so in Parliament earlier this week. While we were talking, I had made a speech in which I talked about the fact that our judiciary is sometimes open to the charge of being complicit in human rights violations because citizens' rights are not always being upheld. So to me, these are the challenges we face. But fortunately, we are fighting for human rights in a democracy. And that is, for me, the biggest hope, that I still have the right and others have the rights to stand up for the right things in our system, in the public space, in the media, in Parliament, in civil society, and in the courts. And all of this is what we'll have to pursue to prevent this problem from getting any worse, as I otherwise do fear.
And on that challenging yet hopeful note, I believe, Natasha, we've run out of time. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, thank you so much for your time and for being willing to speak to us.
Thank you so much, Aljaz. Thank you very much, Aljaz, and thank you very much, Natasha. All the very best.
And congratulations on the launch of your latest book, 23rd in a row, Pride, Prejudice, and Punditry. Congratulations, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Take care. All the best.